George Junius Stinney Jr. was an African-American teenager wrongfully convicted at age 14 of the murder of two white girls in 1944 in his hometown of Alcolu, South Carolina. He was executed in June of that year, still only 14. His appeal to the governor for clemency was denied. He was one of the youngest Americans to be sentenced to death and executed. Two young Caucasian girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were found dead in the company mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, in March of 1944, after they had failed to return home the night before. The 14-year-old African American lived with his father, George Stinney Sr., mother, Emmy, brothers John, 17, and Charles, 12, and sisters Catherine, 10, and Eam, 7. George Sr. worked at the town's sawmill, and the family resided in company housing. Alcolu was a small working-class mill town, where white and black neighborhoods were separated by railroad tracks. The town was typical of small southern towns of the time. Given segregated schools and churches for white and black residents, there was limited interaction between them. The bodies of Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, were found in a ditch on March 23, 1944, on the African-American side of Alcolu, during a search after they had not returned home the night before. The senior George Stinney helped in the search. The girls had been beaten with a weapon, variously reported as a piece of blunt metal or a railroad spike. The girls were last seen riding their bicycles looking for flowers. As they passed the Stinney property, they asked young George Stinney and his sister Aim if they knew where to find maypops, a local name for passion flowers. According to Amy, she was with George at the time the police later established for the murders. According to an article reported by the Wire Services on March 24, 1944, and published widely, with the mistake of the boy's name preserved, the sheriff announced the arrest and said that George Junius had confessed and led officers to a hidden piece of iron. Both girls had suffered blunt force trauma to the face and head. Reports differed as to what kind of weapon was used. According to a report by the medical examiner, these wounds had been inflicted with a blunt instrument by a round head, with the size of a hammer. Both girls' skulls were punctured. The medical examiner reported no evidence of sexual assault to the younger girl, though the genitalia of the older girl were slightly bruised. White men showed up and whisked him away. Alone with the white authorities, he quickly confessed. Or so they said. Like most families in Alcolu, they were poor, but they were fed and clothed. The Stinneys grew vegetables in the garden and drank fresh cow's milk in the morning. Whatever else they needed, with whatever extra money they had, they purchased from the company store on Main Street. On Sundays, they walked to church with the rest of the Alcolu's black families at the nearby Green Hill Baptist Church. Emmy, who was 8, played in the yard with a young brood of Rhode Island red hens as a pair of black cars drove up their street. She watched as white men in suits stepped out of them and walked into the house through the back door.
George Stinney's sister Catherine remembers the day in 1944 like it was yesterday.
This particular day, I went to the beauty parlor with my brother Charles, and my sister Amy stayed home with George. And when we came back, we met her on the road, and she said that George had been taken away. She said, taken away by who? Some men came in the car and took him away. And that was the last. I never saw him again.
Police arrested 14-year-old George in connection with the murder of 2 young girls. About an hour later, a deputy announced George had confessed to the murders. His trial lasted less than a day and resulted in George being sent to the electric chair, making him the youngest person in the nation to be executed during the 20th century. His family and supporters gathered Monday, June 16th, to commemorate the exact day that George was executed 70 years ago.
It makes the world aware that some atrocity went on years ago, and maybe it make the people who did the crime and their families realize that they knew about it and didn't say anything about it. They just let it slide.
AIM hid in the kitchen coop as they hauled George and Johnny away in handcuffs. "George," she cried, "why are you leaving me?" George hollered back, "Go get Kat and Charles, and get Ma." Then George disappeared into one of the black cars. It was the last time she saw her brother alive. That night, George Sr. was fired from his job at the mill. His wife sobbed. They heard a lynch mob was coming. "We gotta leave," George Sr. said. "We gotta get out of here." The family fled to their grandmother's house in Pinewood, taking with them just a few things and leaving the rest behind. Sheriff's deputies released Johnny later, dropping him on the side of the highway, leaving George alone.
His family was not at the execution. His family was not at the trial. Why? Because they told the family, if you don't leave town immediately, we're going to lynch you all. You want to talk about terror? You know, we talk about terrorism today in America. This was true terror. And they weren't there for their 14-year-old boy.
Clarendon Deputy Sheriff H.S. Newman told the papers that within 40 minutes of his arrest, George had confessed to killing the girls. He added that George fatally struck them after they resisted his sexual advances. When they threatened to tell the parents, George picked up a foot-long railroad trestle spike and attacked the younger girl first, bashing her several times on the head before turning his weapon on the other. After confessing, Newman said George led officers to the spot in the woods where he had hidden the spike. Not even George's parents knew where he was. Days turned into weeks as the trial approached, and neither parent saw nor spoke to George. Mrs. Stinney prayed furiously. They didn't have any money. What could they do? "Whatever happens to George," his father said, "is in God's hands now." A mere 31 days after his arrest, George appeared at the Clarendon County Courthouse in downtown Manning, the county seat, dressed in jeans and a faded blue shirt. A reporter from the state newspaper in Columbia noted that George looked calm and apparently a little concerned. The 14-year-old boy had not seen or spoken to his parents for weeks, and they were too terrified of the white mob to show up at the trial. Instead, strangers surrounded him. 1,500 people swelled into the courtroom. Too many to fit. They flowed out of every door. The trial began at 2:30 p.m. and ended less than 3 hours later. A jury of white men deliberated just 10 minutes before returning with a verdict: guilty with no recommendation for mercy. Judge P.H. Stoll of Kingstree handed down his sentence immediately: death by electrocution.
George Stinney Jr., you've been found guilty of murder by this jury. This crime was both brutal and malicious. I hereby sentence you to death by electrocution in accordance with South Carolina state law.
17-year-old Wilford Johnny Hunter got arrested for joyriding in a stolen car with a couple of friends Sumter, about 35 miles away. The ensuing police chase left Hunter with a bullet in the abdomen at Sumter's hospital in grave condition. When he recovered, he wound up at the big jail in Sumter with George, who arrived looking frail and underfed. "Hey kid, Hunter asked. What they got you for? They're going to electrocute me. Shocked, Hunter steadied himself on the bench. Over the course of 3 days, George found a friend. To Hunter, George was the kid who liked to sing country songs from the Grand Ole Opry. One favorite was Ernest Tubbs' Walking the Floor Over You, and play hide and seek in the bunks.
We is proud to have our brother Wilford Johnny Hunter, who was the actual cellmate of George Stinney Jr., quite possibly the youngest person ever electrocuted in 20th century American history.
I do know that my mother had a friend, and she was from Sumter, and that she was coming to visit. My mother asked her to stop by and visit me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
This lady.
Yes,
my
sir.
mother's friend. So when she did, she came by and she mentioned the fact that she stopped by the funeral home on her way over to see me, and that they had burnt him to a crisp.
Wow.
Yeah. That he was, oh man, she says it was terrible what they did to that kid. You know. Yeah. It said he was, oh man. That's what she told me.
Wow.
Because they had him on display at the funeral home.
Oh, wow. Did anybody visit him from his family or friends?
No, man. Everybody had to get out of town, man. His family.
Mm.
He didn't have no one. Nobody. He told me one time, he says, Johnny. I said, what, kid? He says, when they electrocute me, he said, I'm coming back and haunt you, you know? And I said, kid, don't talk that way. True. He didn't have anyone. He didn't have anyone, man. They snuck him out there. I could have been the last black person that he spoke to.
Wow.
You know, because when they came and got him, when they came and got him, man, I can't describe how it was, you know. I just, and I look at him, man, put my hand on the shoulder, and the other guy, and he just say, bye, like that.
He said bye?
He did. He said, the way he said it, when they came for him,
At the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia on June 16, 1944 at 7:30 p.m., standing at 5'1" and weighing just over 90 pounds, Stinney was so small compared to the usual adult prisoners that law officers had difficulty securing him to the frame holding the electrodes. Stinney was made to sit on a Bible in order to fit properly into the chair.
Mass didn't fit, it was an adult's mass. Revealing his wide open, tearful eyes and saliva coming from his mouth. The first jolt had not worked. After 2 more jolts of electricity, the boy was dead. George Stinney was also perfectly innocent, but they needed a scapegoat. And in this country, especially in the South, when they needed a scapegoat, you always knew where they were going to turn. Doesn't mean things haven't gotten better, but we're certainly not at the end of that process. And we've all got to learn from this and work together